On May 5th, 1882, a badass was born. His name was Richard Mawson, and he would go on to spend 2 grueling years in the freezing Arctic. Richard was a highly educated man and got his bachelor's degree in engineering at the University of Sydney. He would go on to teach at universities and accompany several expeditions to explore and map parts of South Wales and the Antarctic. In January of 1912, after launching his own expedition, Mawson landed in Antarctica just south of Australia. Richard and his men set up base camp and unloaded their supplies from the ship. For the next few months, they were forced to remain in their camp, unable to survey the land due to the extreme weather conditions. Winds would regularly reach over 200 miles per hour, and in the month of May, the average wind was around 60 miles per hour. This made leaving the camp next to impossible. But despite this, Mawson and his men made several attempts to navigate the frozen wasteland, but all treks were eventually forced back to the camp with very little progress. By November, our Arctic explorer grew impatient, and despite rough weather conditions, him and 2 other men set out on a trek to map the South Magnetic Pole. For the next month, Mawson and his men, accompanied by 2 sleds and a handful of dogs, would traverse over 300 miles into uncharted territory. While hiking through a particularly dangerous section of ice, one of Richard's partners suddenly disappeared. When Mawson went to investigate, he discovered his partner, along with 6 dogs and most of their supplies, had fallen into a crevasse. They could see an injured dog on a ledge 150 feet down, but they could not see their friend. For the next 3 hours, they would call for him, but got no response. After a short funeral service, they decided to head back to base camp. The return trip was at least a month's hike, but their reserve sled only contained enough food for around a week. This forced them to slaughter a few of their pups to feed themselves and the other sled dogs. The meat was tough and difficult to chew. After all, these dogs were pretty much pure muscle. Because of this, Richard's friend found it difficult to eat the meat and preferred instead the taste of delicious liver. What he was not aware of was that husky liver is extraordinarily high in vitamin A, a fact that would eventually prove fatal in the following days. Mawson noted that his partner's health was rapidly deteriorating. He grew more and more tired and eventually refused to get out of his sleeping bag. He was delirious, malnourished, dehydrated, and freezing. At one point, his madness grew so extreme that he bit off the tip of his frostbitten finger. Mawson was so disturbed and disgusted by this that he did what any friend would do. He sat on his buddy until he calmed down. Well, his friend did calm down, and he calmed down so much that he died. Now, Mawson was alone, 100 miles from base camp with very little food. They had eaten all of the puppies, so he was stuck with very little provisions that were left in the sled. Richard continued his hike, and at one point found himself hanging in a crevasse. He had a harness attached to him, and his sled managed to wedge itself between 2 ice walls while he dangled helplessly below. With little strength left, Mawson managed to pull himself back up and free the sled. He laid in the snow for over an hour, having exhausted every last bit of energy that he had left. Harnessing whatever adrenaline was left in his withering body, he rose to his feet and carried on. Mawson spotted a small camp in the distance that was set up by one of the other groups just hours before he got there. Inside, he found food and a note telling him that the ship was only 23 miles away and was waiting to take him back home. He remained in the camp for a week as a massive blizzard confined him to his tent. His toes were black, his nails fell off, his lips were dark in color, and the tip of his nose resembled more of charcoal than a snout. After days of contemplation, he realized that the storm was not going to let up anytime soon, so Mawson left the camp and headed to the coast. Within a few days, he had finally reached the coast, and he could see the ship off in the distance. As he approached the water, he noticed the ship was not sailing toward him, but away from him. Turns out, Mawson was just a few hours late, and the ship was forced to head back to Australia due to bad weather. Fortunately, there was a crew of 6 men who stayed behind to look for Richard. When he saw them, the men could not believe their eyes. Mawson looked like crap, and he was just a few seconds away from keeling over. They brought him to the camp and within a few days nursed him back to health. When he was feeling better, the men explained to him that they were in contact with the mainland and that it would be another year before a ship was able to reach them. So, no big deal. Mawson had to spend another year in negative 20-degree weather and 200-mile-per-hour winds. He did not have to eat any more dogs, though, as the camp was already well stocked. By February of 1914, Richard had finally made it back home. He was received by massive crowds of people celebrating him in the streets. He would go on to be a legend among explorers and navigators. 20 years after he first set sail for Antarctica, Mawson returned on another expedition. But this time it was just more for nostalgia than research. He retired in 1952 and died warm in his bed in 1958 at the age of 76.